In the minds of many, a magical castle likely conjures images of glittering towers, a valiant prince, and a beautiful princess finding eternal happiness. However, the harsh reality of the Middle Ages painted a starkly different picture. Life within a castle of that era was more akin to a struggle for survival in a dark, damp, and perilous fortress than a stay in a fairy tale palace. Behind those mighty stone walls lurked unbearable stenches, deadly diseases, bone-chilling cold, and rituals that would seem utterly barbaric in the modern world. Yet, castles also served as venues for lavish feasts, solemn oath-taking ceremonies, and the making of fateful decisions that influenced the course of European history. The reader is invited to discover what true life was like in a medieval castle, and which real-life fortress inspired Disney to create one of its most iconic images. Medieval castles were not merely architectural structures of stone. They embodied the pinnacle of feudal power, standing as imposing proof of dominion over a specific territory. From the watchtowers of their keeps, a feudal lord not only ensured the protection of his vassals, but also demonstrated his superiority over other nobles and potential adversaries. The castle, towering over its surroundings, was more than just a building. It was a focal point of power and a symbol of dominance. Within its walls, momentous decisions were made that shaped the lives of entire regions. Justice was administered, the treasury was collected, and defense strategies against enemies were devised. Every element of the castle, from its massive walls to its lofty towers, represented the prestige, material wealth, and absolute authority of its owners. For the peasants whose humble dwellings clustered around the castle, it served simultaneously as a refuge from external threats and a stark reminder of the rigid social hierarchy in which they occupied a subordinate role. The castle was not merely a place of residence, but an epicenter of power, and living within it meant constantly navigating between the need for protection and the necessity of submission. While modern individuals consider a daily shower an indispensable part of life, hygiene in a medieval castle was an almost unattainable luxury. Clean drinking water was extremely scarce, and opportunities to wash were rare, sometimes occurring only every few months or even years. Only members of the nobility occasionally had the chance to use primitive baths, while for most castle inhabitants, this remained an unfulfilled dream. Unpleasant body odors were so widespread that they were simply accepted as commonplace. In attempts to mask these smells, the nobility began to extensively use perfumes and incense with strong fragrances, while servants and soldiers simply grew accustomed to them. However, the problem was not just unpleasant odors. The lack of basic cleanliness and contaminated water created ideal conditions for the spread of diseases. Epidemics, plague, and various viruses found a fertile breeding ground within castle walls. Rats, scurrying through corridors and cellars, carried the deadly threat of plague, exacerbating an already dire sanitary situation. In the medieval era, when the ominous shadow of the plague loomed over the world, life in a castle was a severe trial. The inhabitants of these fortresses had to contend with pervasive filth and live in constant fear of a sudden invasion of disease, for which there was neither prevention nor cure. It is worth noting that medieval castles were not built to provide comfortable living conditions, but as impregnable bastions designed for warfare. Every detail of the castle's architecture, whether a massive wall, a narrow corridor, or a loophole, had a purely defensive purpose. Walls, sometimes several meters thick, had to withstand catapult attacks and prolonged sieges. Windows, which were narrow slits, allowed in only meager light but enabled archers to fire accurately from relative safety. Winding and cramped corridors were designed to disorient enemies who managed to penetrate the castle's interior. The atmosphere inside these gloomy fortresses was oppressive. Dim light and dampness, seeping through the stone walls, constantly reminded inhabitants that this was not a luxurious palace, but a harsh military refuge. Life in a castle effectively meant existing within a defensive machine where protection took precedence over convenience. Beneath many castles lay sinister dungeons, terrifying prisons. These dark, damp, rat-infested cells served as a dwelling for prisoners of war, traitors, and anyone who dared to challenge the feudal lord's authority. In the feudal era, the gloomy dungeons of castles served not merely as places of incarceration, but as symbols of boundless power and cruelty. In these damp and dark chambers, where arbitrariness and lawlessness reigned, punishment was the only justice. Unsanitary conditions transformed imprisonment into a tormenting wait for death, which often came from disease rather than torture, making the fate of the captives truly horrifying. For the castle's inhabitants, the awareness of these sinister chambers served as a constant source of fear and respect for the feudal lord. The dungeon was not only a physical embodiment of terror, but also a continuous reminder of the consequences of disobedience. The threat of vanishing without a trace into the darkness became a powerful tool of control and power maintenance in the Middle Ages, paralyzing willpower and suppressing any display of defiance. No less burdensome an aspect of life in a medieval castle was the pervasive stench. In crowded conditions, and with virtually no sanitation, human waste was often simply thrown from windows or drained into primitive cesspits, polluting the surrounding air. The few toilets available to castle inhabitants were communal and offered no privacy whatsoever. Solitude was an unaffordable luxury, even for crowned heads. Ladies, clad in heavy gowns, were often forced to relieve themselves in discreet corners, shielding themselves with fans and attempting to mask unpleasant odors with perfumes. The stench was so unbearable that even monarchs rarely stayed in the same castle for more than a few weeks, preferring to move to another residence as soon as the air became intolerable. The medieval castle was not merely a dwelling place. It was an entire world hidden behind mighty walls, where reality often contrasted sharply with romantic notions. Despite their external grandeur, medieval castles were permeated by an oppressive atmosphere, filled with heavy and unpleasant odors. The defensive moat surrounding the castle was not just a decorative feature, but a crucial barrier against invading enemies. Filled with stagnant water, fortified with stakes and treacherous traps, the moat virtually eliminated any possibility of a stealthy approach to the castle walls. The main entrance to the castle was via a drawbridge, which served as a symbol of both hospitality and impregnability. In peacetime, it was lowered to allow allies and peasants to pass, but in times of danger, it was swiftly raised, cutting off the castle from the outside world. For the castle's inhabitants, raising the bridge meant not only isolation but also protection from imminent threat. During enemy attacks, local peasants sought refuge within the castle walls and anxiously watched as the moat became an insurmountable barrier for the attackers. It was not merely a physical obstacle, but a symbol of the ingenuity and brutality of the medieval era, where every detail was subservient to a single goal: survival in conditions of constant warfare. A medieval castle represented a miniature city, enclosed within stone confines. Within its walls, nobles, knights, servants, soldiers, cooks, musicians, artisans, and even domestic animals found shelter, creating a vibrant tapestry of medieval life. In medieval castles, life was bustling, sometimes turning into a kaleidoscope of events. While the nobility indulged in refined pleasures at feasts and entertainments, numerous servants worked day and night to ensure the smooth operation of this complex mechanism. Warriors, clad in armor, always stood guard, ready to repel any threat. The majestic halls of the castle became the arena for lavish celebrations, nightly tournaments, and important political negotiations. In the courtyards, under the open sky, blades rang out as defenders honed their combat skills. And, of course, no day passed without the enchanting melodies and inspiring verses of troubadours, brightening the monotonous daily lives of the fortress's inhabitants. However, despite the seeming idle, communal life in the castle was fraught with considerable difficulties. Crowding, social tension, and the constant threat of epidemics or military conflicts transformed existence within the castle walls into a harsh trial rather than a carefree pastime. The castle embodied a hub of contrasts. Luxury and destitution, joy and sorrow, power and powerlessness, all intertwined beneath its massive stone roof. Social inequality was particularly evident in the dining hall of a medieval castle. For the nobility, feasts were a true banquet for both the eyes and the stomach. Aromatic roasts, browned on huge spits, fresh bread, cheeses, juicy fruits, and sparkling wine in precious goblets, all created an atmosphere of abundance and prosperity. Food was not merely a means of sustenance, but a symbol of high status and power. At the same time, for the majority of the castle's inhabitants, the diet was far more modest. Simple vegetable broths, thin soups, and stale bread formed the basis of their daily menu. Meat appeared on the table only on special occasions, and it was often salted or smoked to extend its shelf life. In those times, when unsanitary conditions prevailed, water, almost always contaminated, posed a serious threat to health. Therefore, it was avoided at all costs. As an alternative, people of all social strata, from nobles to commoners, preferred to consume beer or wine. These alcoholic beverages, having undergone fermentation, were safer and helped people to better endure the harsh realities of life in a medieval castle. Consequently, medieval meals became a vivid reflection of social inequality. While some enjoyed luxurious banquets, others barely scraped by, surviving on the bare necessities. The kitchen was typically the warmest room in the castle, a kind of oasis where one could escape the biting cold that seeped through the smallest cracks in the walls. Large hearths burned constantly in the kitchen, intended not only for cooking but also for warming those who toiled among the pots and pans. Cooks and servants spent long hours simmering fragrant stews in enormous iron cauldrons, roasting succulent meat on spits, and baking dense bread that was meant to retain its qualities for several weeks. The rich aroma of smoke, animal fat, and freshly baked bread filled the kitchen space, transforming it into one of the few truly cozy places in the castle. Furthermore, the kitchen served as a kind of meeting and socializing point. Soldiers, servants, and even members of the nobility would visit in search of warmth or a quick bite to eat. Thus, amidst the dim light and dampness that pervaded the castle, the kitchen became a true center of daily life, a beating heart where work thrived, and an atmosphere of warmth and hospitality was maintained. Religion exerted an all-pervading influence on all aspects of medieval life, deeply rooted in the very heart of the castle. Virtually every castle could boast of an internal chapel, which served as a sacred space for religious services, solemn weddings, baptismal rites, and mournful funerals. For noble individuals, the display of religiosity was not merely an expression of personal faith, but also a strategic way to strengthen their power and legitimize their authority in the eyes of their subjects. One of the most significant religious rituals was the knighting ceremony. On the eve of this momentous event, a young man would spend the night in prayerful vigil, clad in a white tunic symbolizing purity of intent. With the first rays of dawn, he would be donned in gleaming armor, a clergyman would bless his sword, and the king or feudal lord would touch his shoulder with the blade, officially elevating him to knighthood. These solemn ceremonies skillfully intertwined spiritual and martial elements, reminding all castle inhabitants that their lives were not only about defense against enemies and political intrigues, but also a deep connection to religion and belief in the divine origin of authority. Within the castle walls, the future generation of the nobility was also forged. Young scions of noble families were sent to the castle as pages or squires, where they learned the fundamentals of discipline, courtly etiquette, and military art. From an early age, they practiced with wooden weapons, tended to the knight's warhorses, and gained valuable knowledge of military strategy, preparing for their future roles as defenders and rulers. In the Middle Ages, when castle walls loomed over the horizon, education played a strategic role, shaping the minds and hearts of those destined to lead and defend feudal lands. Beyond military training, spiritual mentors and teachers brought the light of knowledge, teaching literacy and, above all, revealing the eternal truths of Holy Scripture. In the vast halls of the castles, where the echo of footsteps mingled with the melodies of lutes, medieval culture flourished thanks to troubadours and minstrels. These wandering artists, like living books, recounted heroic sagas, recited poetry, and sang of the exploits of knights, instilling in the hearts of the nobility a sense of pride in their lineage and their lands. However, for commoners, servants, and peasants, the doors of education remained closed. Life itself became their university, and daily duties their teachers. They tilled the land, served their masters, prepared food, and acquired the basic skills necessary for survival in a harsh world. Within the castle walls, culture and education were the preserve of the chosen few, a privilege inaccessible to the majority. Ordinary people could only observe the lives of the nobility from afar, remaining in the shadows, outside the inner circle. The lives of women in a medieval castle, like a bird in a gilded cage, were constrained by strict rules and protocol. Ladies of noble birth spent their days managing the household, engaging in needlework, making music, and upholding the image of honor and virtue that society demanded of them. Although their hands rarely wielded a sword on the battlefield, their influence was undeniable. Often, it was they who took charge of managing the lands in their husband's absence, making important decisions upon which the life of the castle depended. And yet, their freedom remained illusory, and marriages were often concluded not by heartfelt inclination, but as carefully planned political alliances. The lives of the beautiful ladies of that era were rarely dictated by affairs of the heart. Daily inconveniences were their constant companions. Lavish but restrictive dresses, corsets that compressed the waist, and long cloaks created obstacles even for the simplest actions. Fans and aromatic essences served not only to create a pleasant image, but also to mask insufficient hygiene and the lack of personal space. Thus, ladies dwelled in a peculiar gilded cage, where aristocratic privileges coexisted with the rigid confines of social conventions, constantly balancing the display of power with unquestioning obedience. However, there was one factor that equally affected all castle inhabitants, regardless of their social status: the pervasive cold. The majestic stone walls, symbols of impregnability, were simultaneously a source of constant cold and dampness. Invisible cracks allowed streams of icy air to penetrate, and moisture relentlessly seeped through the stonework, leaving persistent damp patches. To mitigate these harsh conditions, floors were covered with straw or dry grass, which also helped to conceal the unpleasant odors inevitable in medieval daily life. In the noble chambers, thick featherbeds were used, but even these could not fully protect against the biting cold. The only place where one could truly warm up was the kitchen, where fires burned unceasingly in large hearths. In castles, those stone witnesses of bygone eras, cold permeated every corner, save for those spots where hearths blazed, warming the fortunate few. Elsewhere, the icy breath of the fortress served as a reminder of its primary purpose: defense against enemy incursions, rather than the creation of a cozy atmosphere. The construction of castles was never a random act. The location of each fortress was determined by strategic considerations, aiming to ensure maximum defensive capability. It is no surprise that most castles stood on hills, rocks, or other elevated positions, offering wide views of the surrounding area, allowing for timely detection of approaching enemies. The heart of every castle was the dungeon, a massive tower that served as the final and most fortified refuge. Here, the feudal lord resided with his family, and provisions, weapons, and other vital resources were stored. In the event of a breach in defense, the dungeon became the last line of protection, offering hope for survival. The spiral staircases leading to the dungeon were steep and narrow, presenting a serious obstacle to attackers. Anyone who managed to reach this stronghold would face the most fortified part of the entire castle complex. The dungeon served not only as a symbol of the feudal lord's power and might, but also as the last bastion of hope, a place where one could take shelter and hold out when all other defenses had fallen. Despite the harsh conditions and domestic inconveniences, medieval castles have left an indelible mark on history and culture. Their grandeur and impregnability continue to stir the imagination and inspire the creation of new works of art and literature many centuries after their heyday. The human imagination knows no bounds, capable of transforming reality beyond recognition. A splendid example of this is the Alcazar, towering in Segovia, Spain. Its monumental appearance and soaring turrets served as the prototype for Disney's famous Cinderella Castle. It's amusing that today, millions of people see it as the embodiment of magic and dreams, forgetting that it was once an impregnable and harsh fortress, where life was full of the hardships and privations characteristic of medieval castles. The divergence between historical truth and romanticized fairy tales is truly vast. However, it is precisely this contrast that serves as a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the past, human imagination can give birth to timeless dreams and inspiring images. It is worth noting that daily life in a medieval castle was far from fairy tale notions. Cold, dirt, stench, and the constant threat of disease or military action turned life into a struggle for survival rather than a privilege. Nevertheless, castles were centers for historical decisions, venues for solemn ceremonies, and outstanding architectural monuments that continue to captivate audiences today. Understanding the past paves the way for comprehending the present and shaping ideas about the future.